A wealthy widow discovers that her late husband had a humble son outside of their marriage. Days later, she meets him and makes an unexpected request for him to help her restore the restaurant left behind by her husband. But what she doesn't yet know is that this meeting will bring to light even deeper and more painful secrets, capable of changing their lives forever. How will this discovery impact their relationship? Can they both overcome the lies of the past? And most importantly, why did her husband hide this secret for so many years? These answers will only be revealed as they grow closer, battling their own pains and challenges. Stay until the end, because the outcome of this story is truly surprising and will leave you speechless. Vivian Holloway stood in the center of her late husband Thomas's old office, surrounded by luxury that no longer meant anything to her. The heavy, dark velvet curtains blocked out the sunlight, while the silence of the enormous house echoed in her ears. She had lived there for over 30 years, and now every corner of the mansion felt colder, suffocating. It wasn't the fortune that Thomas had left her that mattered. Vivian had never been a woman driven by money. What kept her in that house were the memories of the restaurant he loved so dearly, the legacy he had started, and her promise to restore it. The restaurant was a symbol of Thomas's hard work, the love they shared for the place, and for her, the only thing that still made sense. Ever since Thomas's death, everything seemed to have lost its luster. That restaurant was the last part of her life that still connected her to him, and it was what kept her going. So even though she felt consumed by grief, Vivian dedicated her days to its restoration. But that day felt different. She sensed an inexplicable discomfort. Perhaps it was the heavy atmosphere of the office, or the simple fact that, after months of sifting through Thomas's belongings, she still couldn't find any peace. Every drawer seemed to hold nothing but more memories, more pain. She approached the desk, her heart tight, and tried to open one of the locked drawers. It was one she had never touched, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of fear of what she might find. For some reason that day, curiosity won. Vivian's hands trembled as she searched for the small key that always sat in a drawer nearby. Upon finding it, she unlocked the drawer, and there at the bottom lay a yellowed envelope, its corners bent and fragile with age. Vivian felt her heart race. She held the envelope carefully, as if any sudden movement would cause it to disintegrate. What could be inside? Her eyes focused on the faded lettering in the corner, nearly illegible, as if someone had tried to hide its contents. She hesitated, but then, taking a deep breath, tore the seal. What she saw left her paralyzed. Legal documents, detailed and formal, revealed a truth that seemed impossible. Thomas had a son, a 25-year-old son, a son she had never known existed. His name? Jack. Vivian's head spun as she read and reread the words. She felt the air leave her lungs, as if the weight of that long-held secret was finally being revealed, bringing with it a whirlwind of emotions. Who was Jack? How could Thomas have hidden something like this for so many years? Why had he never told her? Questions swirled in her mind like a tempest, but the most devastating feeling was betrayal. Vivian had always believed that her marriage, despite its ups and downs, was built on trust. Now, that trust seemed like an illusion. She recalled moments when Thomas had seemed distant, the silences she never questioned. Now, everything made sense. There was something more, there was someone more, and that someone was Jack. The restaurant, which just moments ago had seemed like the last link between her and Thomas, now felt like just another part of the facade. How could she move forward with the restoration knowing there was so much she didn't know about the man she had shared her life with? Vivian's mind was in shambles. She felt her legs weaken, and before she knew it, she was on her knees on the office floor, the papers falling around her. Trembling hands covered her face as tears began to stream down. The pain of betrayal was overwhelming. The man she had loved with all her being, with whom she built a life and shared so many memories, was someone she might never have truly known. Everything that once felt solid in her life was crumbling. Her breath was uneven, each inhale feeling like a monumental effort. She looked around the office, the walls filled with memories of Thomas, but now every picture, every book, every object seemed to carry a weight she could not bear. Her breathing became even more labored as she tried to comprehend how to move forward. Vivian looked again at the papers. Jack's name stood out, clear as a mark of the past that was now part of her present. Who was this young man? What did he know about Thomas? Did he know he had a father? Or had he also been kept in the dark all this time? Struggling to her feet, Vivian picked up the scattered papers from the floor. There was an address. Her first impulse was to confront this Jack, to demand answers. But at the same time, she knew that this meeting could bring more questions than solutions. Vivian was caught between despair and doubt. She knew she needed to learn more about Jack, but what would happen when she finally found him? And what would it mean for Thomas's legacy and the restaurant she had committed to restoring? As she held the papers, the dilemma consumed her. Should she proceed with her restoration plans or give up now that she knew the lies hidden in the past? Vivian had to decide, and that decision would change everything. The days following the discovery were a blur in Vivian's life. The house, once her fortress, now felt more like a prison, filled with memories and lies. She could no longer focus on the restaurant renovation, something that had previously been her reason to continue after Thomas's death. The place that once represented love, history, and dedication was now becoming a symbol of betrayal. Every inch of that restaurant seemed to scream the lies she had uncovered. Vivian locked herself away at home, avoiding the renovation crew, friends, and the outside world. Whenever she looked at the papers revealing the existence of Jack, the son Thomas had with another woman, rage and sadness intertwined in her chest. She wondered how Thomas could have lived a double life, hiding something so significant. What did it mean for her? The image she had of her husband was utterly shattered. After days of uncertainty, confusion gave way to a decision. She needed to confront the truth. Jack wasn't to blame for what had happened, but his existence was the key to understanding what Thomas had hidden. Perhaps by meeting Jack, she could find some peace, some explanation for what had transpired. With this in mind, Vivian resolved to seek him out. The city where Jack lived wasn't far, but the journey there felt endless. Every mile driven brought memories of Thomas rushing back with greater intensity. She recalled how he smiled when talking about the restaurant, how his eyes sparkled at the sight of it thriving. Now she couldn't separate the man she knew from the man who had concealed an entire life from her. As she drove along the winding roads, Vivian tried to focus on what she would say to Jack, but her mind repeatedly drifted to the past. Was it possible that Thomas had a genuine relationship with Jack, and yet never mentioned him? Or did Jack also remain unaware of his father's true identity? The questions gnawed at her, intensifying the tension with every passing mile. The radio played softly in the background, but Vivian barely heard the music. Her mind was elsewhere. With each mile, the weight of betrayal felt heavier, the pain more acute. When she finally arrived in the city, her hands trembled and her heart raced. Jack lived in a modest house in the suburbs, a stark contrast to the luxurious residence she had shared with Thomas. The disparity between their two lives hit her like a punch to the gut. She parked in front of the house and paused for a moment, staring at the door. For a brief instant, she considered turning back and pretending none of this had happened, but she knew that wasn't an option. She needed answers. Taking a deep breath, she got out of the car and walked toward the door, the sound of her footsteps echoing on the quiet asphalt. When Vivian finally raised her hand to knock on the door, her legs felt like jelly. Each rap on the wooden door seemed louder than the last. The silence that followed the final knock was unbearable, each second dragging as she awaited a response. Then the door swung open. Jack stood there, a look of surprise on his face, clearly confused to see an unfamiliar woman at his door. Vivian struggled to speak, paralyzed for a moment as she took in his features. Although he was very young, she could see something of Thomas in him. Perhaps it was the shape of his eyes or the way he regarded her, a mix of curiosity and caution. This disarmed her. The pain she carried in her chest felt even heavier, as if she were facing a ghost of Thomas. "Can I help you?" Jack asked, breaking the silence that felt eternal. His voice was polite but distant, as if he wasn't used to unexpected visitors. Vivian felt a lump in her throat, but she knew she couldn't hesitate now. "My name is Vivian Holloway," she began, but the words faltered. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. I was married to Thomas Holloway," she finished, her voice trembling. Jack frowned, clearly confused. He stepped back slightly, still holding the door with one hand. The name didn't seem to have an immediate impact on his expression, but discomfort was evident. Vivian took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but the weight of everything she had discovered felt like it might crush her in that moment. "I think we need to talk," she said, struggling to maintain her composure. Jack hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he tried to grasp the situation. He had no idea who this woman was or why she stood at his door, but something in the way she spoke made him realize it was something serious. With a nod, he opened the door wider, allowing her to enter. "Come in," he said, maintaining a controlled tone. Vivian stepped into the modest house, feeling the air weigh heavily on her shoulders. The space was simple yet cozy, a far cry from the luxurious world she shared with Thomas. She sat down on the couch, the silence between them becoming almost unbearable. Jack stood nearby, watching her closely, as if waiting for her to explain what was happening. Vivian glanced around, trying to find something that connected her to Thomas, but everything felt distant. She knew the moment was approaching, the moment when she would have to reveal the truth. Jack looked at Vivian, still confused but intrigued. "So, what exactly do you want to talk about?" he asked, crossing his arms. Vivian, sitting on the couch, felt the weight of the words she would have to say. She took a deep breath and looked at him, knowing that what she was about to reveal would change both their lives forever. What she didn't know was how Jack would react to the devastating truth that Thomas Holloway, the man he had never known, was his father. Would he accept the truth or reject everything Vivian was about to share?
Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave a comment about what you think so far. This is really important for the growth of the channel and helps us bring more emotional stories like this one.
Vivian sat nervously on the small sofa in Jack's house, the simple surroundings reminding her that she was far from the world she shared with Thomas. Jack stood, tense and suspicious, with a serious expression as he awaited an explanation that she knew would change both their lives forever. There was no way to soften the truth. Vivian took a deep breath and with trembling hands pulled a crumpled envelope from her bag. "I was married to Thomas Holloway, your father." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. The impact was immediate. Jack, who had maintained a calm and collected demeanor until now, stood frozen, his eyes wide. He remained silent for a few moments, absorbing the information. When he finally moved, it was to take the envelope Vivian was holding with pale fingers. The shock on his face was evident, but something about the way he grasped the envelope, almost calculatingly, made Vivian hesitate. "What are you saying?" Jack murmured, carefully opening the envelope. His eyes quickly scanned the document that confirmed what Vivian had just said. The certificate, the legal papers, everything was there, clear as day. Thomas Holloway was Jack's biological father. Jack continued to stare at the document for too long, as if he already knew what it said. With her heart racing, Vivian watched every movement he made. There was something strange about how Jack was reacting. He didn't seem exactly surprised, but he wasn't relieved either. "I didn't know," Jack said, his voice now a bit firmer. "I never knew this." But something in the way he spoke those words didn't feel genuine. Jack continued to stare at the document as if waiting for it to change, his fingers nervously rubbing the corner of the page. His face didn't reflect the total confusion that Vivian expected to see. Instead, there was a discomfort, a palpable tension. He seemed to be hiding something, something she couldn't quite decipher. Vivian hesitated but decided to ask directly. "Jack, you really didn't know? Is all of this a surprise to you?" She knew the question was delicate, but she needed to understand what was happening. After all, if Jack already knew about Thomas, why had he remained silent? Jack turned his gaze away, moving to the window. He appeared lost for a moment, as if he were processing the magnitude of the revelation, but something about the way he avoided looking at her began to disturb Vivian. "I always thought my father was my stepfather," he began, his voice cautious. "He raised me as his son. I always thought that if Thomas knew about me, he would have come looking." His words seemed convincing, but the look in Jack's eyes didn't convey the same certainty. Vivian remembered every little detail she had read in the documents, every date and financial transaction that Thomas had hidden. Now, she felt that she wasn't the only one keeping secrets in that room. "Jack," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "I know this is a lot, but I need to be honest with you. I found evidence that Thomas knew about you. He knew for many years. There are even records showing he supported you financially on a few occasions, discreetly, but you never wondered why." Jack turned his back to her, staring into the void outside the window. He pressed his lips together before responding, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I don't remember any of this," he said coldly. "If Thomas did something for me, it wasn't something I knew about. My mother never mentioned anything." Vivian felt a shiver run down her spine. There was more to this story. She was sure of it now. Jack was hiding something, but why? Did he know more about Thomas than he was admitting? Or did he have his own reasons for keeping silent? What was clear was that, just as Thomas had lived two lives, Jack seemed divided between the past and the present. Vivian stood up from the sofa, now more anxious than before. She felt that the distance between them was not just physical. There was an invisible barrier built with years of unspoken secrets. "You never wondered about him? If Thomas was really absent, why didn't you ever try to learn more?" Jack turned abruptly, his face now tense. "And why should I? He never wanted anything to do with me. I grew up believing my stepfather was my father, and he gave me everything Thomas never wanted to give. What does it matter now? He's dead. It makes no difference." Vivian saw the anger in Jack's eyes, but she knew that wasn't the complete truth. There was pain, of course, but there was also a kind of calculated control. He was hiding more than he wanted to admit. "Jack," she said in a low but firm voice, "I understand what you're feeling, the pain, the anger. I felt the same when I found out about you. But this isn't just about what Thomas did or didn't do. This is about the truth. And if you knew about him, if you already knew who he was, why didn't you tell me before?" Jack fell silent. The tension in the room was palpable. He was caught in an internal dilemma. It seemed as if he was about to explode, but instead he stepped closer to Vivian, his dark eyes filled with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me," he whispered, his voice finally breaking. "Everything I've lived, everything I thought I knew about my life. If all of this is true, then I've lived a lie too." Vivian felt the raw pain in Jack's words. There was something deeper there, something she still couldn't reach. She wanted to offer comfort, but she also wanted answers. What was he hiding? Jack stepped away again, walking toward the door. "I need some time," he said, not looking at her, "to process all of this." Vivian stood still, watching him in silence, her mind filled with questions. Did Jack know more than he was saying, or was he as lost as she was? One thing was certain, this revelation was far from the end. The days that followed the revelation were filled with uncertainty. For both Vivian and Jack, life seemed to have been turned upside down. They were grappling with a truth that, while inevitable, was overwhelming. Yet amidst all the confusion, there was a connection neither could ignore: the shared pain, the void left by Thomas, and the need to find some semblance of meaning in the chaos. Vivian, still processing Thomas's betrayal and the existence of Jack, was trying to reorganize her thoughts. She knew she couldn't erase the past, but there was something she could do about the future. Sitting in her kitchen, reflecting on the past few weeks, she finally made a decision. She needed to take a step forward, and perhaps Jack could help her on that path. On the third day after their first meeting, she called Jack. His voice on the other end was cold yet polite. She knew he was still processing everything, but she also knew she had to try. "Jack," she began hesitantly, "I know this is a lot, and I understand if you don't want to, but I wanted to invite you to something." Jack fell silent, and Vivian felt the weight of the tension between them. The restaurant. The place where Thomas poured so much of his life. "I can't handle all of this alone, and I think maybe we both can work on it together. Not for him, but for us." She wasn't sure if her words would resonate with Jack, but she had to try. He took a deep breath on the other end. "I need to think about it," he said almost automatically. Vivian, sensing his hesitation, replied, "I understand. It's not an easy decision, but I think it would be a way to transform all this pain into something better." Jack spent the following days in emotional turmoil. The revelation about Thomas still weighed heavily on him, and Vivian's invitation left him in a dilemma. He had spent so long not knowing the truth about his biological father, and now, suddenly, he was being invited to be part of his legacy. It both troubled and intrigued him. Perhaps by helping to restore the restaurant, he could learn more about the man he had never known. That night, Jack went to the local bar, where he often went to clear his mind. Sitting on a worn wooden stool, he stared at the beer in front of him, lost in thought. Life continued around him, with laughter and conversation filling the air, but none of it seemed to reach him. He was alone with his reflections. In a strange way, working with Vivian made sense. There was something odd yet familiar about her, and despite all the resentment, he knew she was hurting too. Jack was used to dealing with pain alone, but maybe this time he could share that burden. Not for Thomas, who had left a trail of secrets, but for himself. The next day, he picked up the phone and called Vivian. "I'm going to do it," he said without preamble. "But I want to make it clear, this is for me, not for Thomas." Vivian smiled softly on the other end of the line. "I understand, Jack, and I appreciate that. Let's start slowly, no rush." When Jack arrived at the restaurant for the first time a few days later, Vivian was already there, gazing at the building with a mix of nostalgia and uncertainty. The place was in disrepair, with peeling walls and a musty smell lingering in the air, but there was still something special about it, something that could be restored. "So, where do we start?" Jack asked, looking around with his hands shoved in his pockets. He tried to keep his voice neutral, but the emotional weight of the place was evident. Vivian smiled, despite the hesitation she felt. "We have a lot of work ahead of us," she said, "but I think we can start by cleaning everything up. Put things in order, you know." And so they began. At first the work was silent, almost formal. Jack removed old furniture and boxes full of dust while Vivian took care of small repairs on the walls. But as the days went by, something began to change. The distance between them started to close, and simple conversations about the restaurant evolved into deeper discussions about life. Vivian, still carrying the weight of Thomas's betrayal, found in Jack a way to alleviate some of that pain, and Jack, in turn, began to see in Vivian something beyond a woman wounded by the past. They were two people dealing with the consequences of a man who had, in different ways, betrayed them both. One afternoon, after hours of painting and cleaning, they were exhausted, but the restaurant was beginning to come back to life. Jack, covered in paint, leaned against a wall and looked at Vivian with a tired yet genuine smile. "Maybe we can make this work," he said, for the first time letting a small spark of hope emerge. Vivian laughed softly, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, also covered in dust and paint. "I think we can," she replied. The connection between them was now stronger. They still had much to resolve, many unresolved feelings, but they were starting to build something together. It wasn't just the restaurant that was coming back to life, it was their relationship. That night, as Vivian locked up the restaurant, she felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Something good was happening there, but many shadows from the past still lingered. She knew Jack still carried secrets, and that sooner or later, this would come to light. What she didn't know was how this would affect the new connection they were building. Now that Jack and Vivian had begun to work together, could they truly transform the restaurant into something that belonged to them? Or would Thomas's secrets, which had yet to be fully revealed, end up tearing them apart before they even had a chance to start something solid? The night before the restaurant's grand opening arrived faster than Vivian had imagined. She sat alone at one of the newly restored tables, observing the space with a mix of pride and melancholy. The place was finally ready, but what occupied her mind more was the new relationship she had built with Jack. Working side by side for the past several weeks had created a connection that felt vital to her. She hoped this partnership would mark the beginning of something new for both of them. Jack entered the restaurant in silence, his expression closed off. Something was different about him that evening. Vivian sensed it the moment he walked through the door. He seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been present in their previous days of work. Jack walked slowly to where Vivian was sitting and took a seat across from her without saying a word. The silence between them was unsettling. She looked at him, waiting for him to say what was clearly stuck in his throat. "Jack, is everything okay?" she asked, trying to break the tension that seemed to be growing between them. He lifted his gaze, and Vivian saw the truth in his eyes before he even spoke. Something was deeply wrong. Jack took a deep breath, as if preparing for an inevitable blow. "Vivian, I can't keep going like this," he began, his voice low and heavy with guilt. Vivian felt her stomach churn. The sensation that something devastating was about to happen washed over her. "What do you mean?" she asked hesitantly. Jack looked away, unable to meet her gaze. I knew that Thomas was my father." The words echoed in the empty space of the restaurant. For a moment, Vivian didn't know how to react. She stared at him, unblinking, trying to process what he had just said. The trust she had built in the past weeks began to crumble. Jack finally met her gaze, pain clear in his eyes. "I found out a few years ago," he continued, his voice now wavering. "I learned from my mother. She told me about Thomas, about what he did and why he was never in my life. But I decided I wouldn't seek him out." Vivian felt the impact of Jack's words like a punch to the gut. The world around her seemed to spin, and she had to grip the table to keep from losing her balance. "You knew? You knew all this time and never told me?" Her voice started as a whisper, but soon turned into a desperate shout. "Why, Jack? Why did you hide this from me?" Jack lowered his head, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. "I didn't want to hurt you more, Vivian. There was already enough pain. My mother was destroyed by Thomas. He abandoned her and left her alone to raise a child. I never wanted to bring that weight onto you too." But his words did little to alleviate the growing pain in Vivian's chest. The trust, the bond she believed they were forming, now felt like a lie. She stood abruptly, pushing her chair back. "You didn't want to hurt me? You thought hiding this from me, living this facade, was the best way to handle it." Vivian's voice was laden with hurt and betrayal. She started pacing, hands on her face as she tried to contain her tears. "I trusted you. I thought we were healing together, rebuilding something from what Thomas destroyed. And now you tell me you knew all along." Jack stood up, trying to move closer, but she backed away. "Vivian, please understand. I never wanted it to happen like this. I thought if I told you, it would only bring more pain, more unanswered questions." "You should have trusted me," she screamed, the tears finally streaming down her face. "You should have been honest from the beginning." Vivian felt her heart heavy. The pain of being betrayed once again, first by Thomas and now by Jack, was unbearable. She had started to trust him, to see in Jack a chance for healing for both of them, but now it felt like just another lie in her life. "Do you think lying to me was the solution?" she continued, her voice trembling. "Do you think that by hiding this, you were protecting me? Because all you did was hurt me even more." Jack stood there, shoulders slumped, at a loss for words. He knew there was nothing he could say to ease the pain he had caused. "I'm so sorry, Vivian," he finally said, but his words felt empty, distant. "Apologies don't fix this, Jack," she replied, wiping her tears away with anger. I thought we were building something real. Now I see it was all an illusion. You betrayed me, just like Thomas did." Jack moved closer, his voice desperate. "Please, don't compare me to him. I just wanted to protect you, to protect my mother. Thomas destroyed us, and I thought I was preventing that from happening again. I was wrong, but please don't push me away." Vivian looked at him, her eyes filled with hurt. "You've already done that on your own, Jack." Without saying anything more, she grabbed her things and headed for the door. Each step she took pulled her further away from Jack, from everything they had built together. And deep down, she wondered if she would ever be able to forgive him. She paused at the entrance, glanced back at the restaurant one last time, and with tears in her eyes, she left. The pain was overwhelming, but the need to break free from that cycle of lies was greater. Jack stood there, alone in the empty restaurant, the weight of guilt crushing his shoulders. He knew he had made a mistake, knew he could have prevented this. But now, with Vivian gone, the doubt hung in the air. Had he lost any chance at reconciliation?
If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. This is super important for the channel's growth. And in the comments, share your reflections on what has happened so far.
The night of the grand opening had finally arrived, a moment that should have been one of celebration and pride. The restaurant was immaculate, restored with attention to every detail, reflecting the hard work that Vivian and Jack had invested together over the past weeks. The sound of lively conversations and laughter filled the air, wine glasses sparkling under the soft glow of the chandeliers, and the guests seemed enchanted by the cozy atmosphere. But for Vivian, that night was anything but a celebration. She stood near the bar, holding a glass of champagne that she could barely bring herself to drink. The sparkle in the guests' eyes contrasted sharply with the coldness in her heart. Around her, people toasted to the new phase of the restaurant, praising the revival of a place that, for many, bore the mark of Thomas's legacy. However, for Vivian, the restaurant was no longer a symbol of love or memory. It was a monument to the lies Thomas had hidden, and now it also represented the betrayal Jack had inflicted by concealing his truth. From a distance, she spotted Jack, standing across the room. He was chatting with some guests, but his gaze seemed lost. They had avoided any meaningful conversation since the night of the confession, and the emptiness between them was now more apparent than ever. Even surrounded by people, Jack appeared completely out of place, just like her. Vivian sighed, feeling the weight of everything that had happened over the past weeks. The restaurant was ready, but she couldn't find joy in it. This opening should have been a moment of triumph, a fresh start. Instead, all she felt was deep uncertainty. Could she forgive Jack? And more importantly, did she want to? As the hours passed, to the guests, the night was an absolute success. The food was excellent, the service impeccable, and the restaurant's atmosphere was perfect. But for Vivian, the noise around her was just a distant blur. She kept watching Jack, observing how he moved through the room, interacting with people but not truly present. She knew Jack was also grappling with the burden of his choices, but that didn't make the pain she felt any easier. As he conversed, there was something in his posture, the way he kept his head down for brief moments between sentences, that revealed his own anguish. He was as isolated as she was, both trapped in the same whirlwind of unresolved hurt. Vivian felt the eyes of some guests turning towards her, expecting her to toast or say something about the restaurant's success. Reluctantly, she raised her glass of champagne and, without saying a word, took a small sip, just enough to fulfill the gesture. She knew the people around her didn't perceive what was happening between her and Jack, and that made the burden she carried feel even heavier. What was the point of all this success if, inside, she was broken? Jack also raised his glass from where he stood, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. The silence between them, even amid so many people, was deafening. They were on opposite sides of the room, but it felt as if they were miles apart. When their gazes locked, for an instant, she almost saw the same person with whom she had built the restaurant. Almost. But then, the memory of Jack's confession and the lies resurfaced, shattering that fleeting connection. As the night drew to a close and the guests began to leave, praising the work she and Jack had done on the restaurant, Vivian could barely process their words. Her heart was focused on something else, on someone else. She glanced at Jack one last time as the final customers said their goodbyes and knew that she needed to confront him again. There was still something unresolved, something that needed to be said. Vivian approached him slowly. Jack was now leaning against one of the walls, seemingly relieved that the night was ending. When she got closer, he seemed to tense up as if expecting the worst. And in a way, he was right. There was a weight between them that couldn't be ignored, a weight she needed to face. "Jack," she began, her voice softer than she expected, "tomorrow we need to talk." It wasn't a request. It was a statement, something definitive, inevitable. He simply nodded, unable to say anything. The atmosphere between them was cold, distant. Even with everything they had built together, there was now an invisible barrier, something that felt insurmountable. For Vivian, that night should have been about redemption, about concluding a journey, but all she felt was uncertainty. Was there still hope for them? She looked around the restaurant one last time that night. The empty tables, the dim lights, and the silence reminded her that the physical space was complete, but what truly mattered, the trust and connection between them, was in ruins. It felt as if everything they had built was merely a facade, something that was about to crumble from within. Jack watched Vivian walk away and exit through the door without looking back. He knew that the conversation they would have the next day could change everything. He just didn't know if he was ready for it. The silence of the night enveloped the empty restaurant, with Jack still standing, staring at the door through which Vivian had just left. He knew that tomorrow everything would be different. But the question lingering in the air was, would it be the end of everything or the beginning of something new? Would the conversation between Vivian and Jack pave the way for reconciliation, or would the distance between them become irreparable? Could Jack prove the sincerity of his intentions, or would the lies of the past weigh heavier than any gesture of redemption? The morning after the grand opening, the restaurant was quiet. Sunlight streamed through the windows, but the lightness of the atmosphere contrasted sharply with the weight Vivian carried in her chest. She was about to confront Jack, and the events of the previous night still echoed in her mind. She knew this conversation would be definitive, determining their future together. As she arranged a few tables, preparing the space for the day, the restaurant door unexpectedly swung open. Vivian lifted her gaze, expecting to see Jack, but instead found a woman standing at the entrance. She had a firm posture, yet her face revealed a mix of fatigue and pain. For a moment, Vivian didn't recognize her. "Can I help you?" Vivian asked, her voice steady. The woman took a few steps inside, her eyes scanning the room as if assessing every detail. "You're Vivian, right?" Her voice was cold but tinged with sadness. Vivian nodded, feeling discomfort swell within her. "Yes, and you are?" "Helen, Jack's mother." The name made Vivian's heart race. Jack's mother? She had never imagined she would encounter Helen so unexpectedly. Jack had never spoken much about her, and the mystery surrounding her life only deepened. "Oh, I didn't know you were coming," Vivian said, trying to mask her surprise. Helen stepped closer, her hands trembling as she approached one of the tables. "I didn't come to talk about Jack, Vivian. I came to discuss Thomas." The mention of Thomas's name made Vivian's stomach churn. The coldness of betrayal crept up her spine. What did Helen know about Thomas? And why was she here now, at this moment, when Vivian was on the brink of confronting Jack? Helen sat down at one of the chairs and Vivian followed suit, facing her. Helen's gaze was steady, but there was a profound sorrow there, a pain Vivian recognized. "You knew that Thomas knew Jack, but what you don't know is that he always knew. All these years he knew Jack was his son." The words fell like a bomb. Vivian felt her body freeze. She shook her head, trying to process what she was hearing. "He knew? All these years?" Her voice came out weak, almost inaudible. Helen nodded, her eyes filling with sadness. "Thomas paid me, Vivian. He paid me to keep Jack and me away, to protect his reputation. He knew, but he never wanted to be a part of Jack's life." Vivian felt as though the ground was opening up beneath her. Thomas's betrayal, which had already been devastating, now seemed even greater, deeper. All those years she believed her husband was an honorable man, devoted to his legacy. It was all a lie. He was not just a man who made a mistake. He was a man who deliberately hid his son and paid to keep it a secret. "Are you saying he deceived me all this time?" Vivian asked, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't want to believe that everything she knew about Thomas was a lie. "I spent years defending his name, trying to keep alive the legacy of a man who—" Helen interrupted with a heavy sigh. "He wasn't the man you thought he was. He may have loved you, Vivian, but Thomas always put his reputation above everything. I tried to fight against it. I tried to convince Jack not to get involved, but now I think the lies are finally being revealed." Vivian felt her chest tighten. The truth was so harsh, so unbearable. She couldn't believe she had spent so many years with a man who hid something so significant, who lived a life of secrets while she believed everything between them was clear, transparent. The anger mixed with pain began to take hold. "Why are you telling me this now?" Vivian asked, struggling to control the emotions bubbling inside her. Helen looked directly into her eyes, her voice heavy with bitterness. "Because you deserve to know the truth. And Jack, he deserves more than the lies Thomas built around him. I was willing to keep this a secret for the rest of my life, but after seeing him involved with the restaurant with what Thomas left behind, I can't bear it anymore." Vivian took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what she had just heard. Everything she believed about Thomas's legacy, about the restaurant, about the life they built together, was crumbling. How could she continue to uphold the name of a man who had done something so cruel? She thought about the weeks of working alongside Jack, the connection that had been built. Now everything felt tainted by the shadow of Thomas. The hurt she felt toward Jack was transforming into something deeper, profound sadness for everything he had also lost. Thomas didn't just betray Vivian, he deprived Jack of a lifetime of truths. Helen watched in silence as if she understood what Vivian was going through. "I'm so sorry, Vivian. Truly. I know this doesn't erase what he did, but you deserve to know." Vivian could barely respond. Her hands trembled. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of an abyss, about to fall. Everything she believed about her husband, about the man with whom she had shared her life, was in ruins. And now she wondered, how much more had he hidden? Were there more secrets buried? Completely devastated, Vivian stood up from the table, her face pale and her eyes filled with tears. She looked at Helen, who returned her gaze with an expression that mixed compassion and guilt. Vivian left the restaurant feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. Would she ever truly know the whole truth about the man she shared her life with? Or were Thomas's lies still far from being fully revealed? The restaurant was quiet, empty after the opening night, but Vivian's mind was still racing. The revelations of the past few days weighed heavily on her shoulders. Thomas's lies, Jack's secret, and the devastating truth brought forth by Helen. Her entire world, once built on memories and legacies, seemed to have crumbled. The image she had of Thomas, carefully protected for so many years, lay in ruins. She knew she couldn't continue living this way. Remaining in Thomas's shadow would be a prison. The man she had loved for so long had hidden deep and painful secrets, but that no longer needed to define her life. Now was the moment to move forward, to seek something that was solely hers. Vivian walked over to the bar and grabbed the keychain that held the keys to the place. Jack was seated at the back, his eyes fixed on the floor. They had avoided any direct confrontation since Helen's revelation, and the silence between them, though heavy, mirrored what they were both experiencing internally. With the keys in hand, Vivian approached Jack. He lifted his eyes at the sight of her, and for a moment it seemed he guessed what was coming. "This place belongs to you now, Jack," Vivian said, placing the keys on the table in front of him. "I have lived in Thomas's shadow for too long, but I don't want you to live in mine." Jack stared at the keys, then back at Vivian. Shock and disbelief etched on his face. "Vivian, you're as much a part of this as I am. You fought for this place, worked so hard for it. You can't just give up." Vivian smiled slightly, a serene expression that reflected a long-awaited decision. "I'm not giving up, Jack. I'm moving on. I need to find something that is just mine, something not marked by Thomas's past. You can do this for me, for both of us." Jack fell silent, wrestling with the idea of letting her go. He didn't want her to abandon the restaurant, to disappear from his life. But at the same time, he knew she was right. She needed a fresh start. Maybe he did too. Jack stood up and, without saying a word, stepped forward and embraced Vivian tightly. It was a silent hug, heavy with emotions. The pain of the past was still there, but it was mixed with the understanding that they were both seeking something new. Vivian closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel that moment, tears streaming silently down her face. But this time the tears were of liberation, not sorrow. "I'm so sorry for everything, Vivian," Jack murmured, his voice hoarse. "I know, Jack," she replied softly yet firmly, "but the past is behind us now. We need to move forward." They pulled away, both visibly emotional, but something had changed between them. The weight that had separated them was lifting. Jack grasped the keys more firmly now, realizing that Vivian was ready to let him take over the restaurant. "I'll take good care of it," he promised. Vivian nodded. "I know you will." Days later, Vivian left the city. Using part of the fortune she inherited from Thomas, she bought a small inn in a coastal town, far removed from the burdens of her past. The place was simple, yet welcoming, a refuge for those, like her, seeking renewal and peace. Every detail of the inn reflected her new phase of life, something she was building without the shadow of Thomas. Months passed, and Vivian, now fully immersed in her new life, found a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The routine of caring for the inn, welcoming guests, and smelling the sea each morning brought the serenity she had been searching for. It was a simple life, but it was genuine, and more importantly, it was hers. On a quiet afternoon, while tending to her garden, a letter arrived. The envelope was carefully sealed, with Jack's name handwritten on the front. Vivian's heart raced slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside was a photo of the restaurant, now completely renovated and vibrant. The colors, the details, everything looked immaculate. She smiled at how much Jack had succeeded in transforming the place. In the letter, Jack wrote, "Everything we built together is here. A part of you lives in every corner. Thank you for everything, Vivian." Vivian smiled, but this time there was no sadness, only gratitude. The sea breeze caressed her face as she held the letter. Jack had found his path, and so had she. Their lives were finally moving forward, away from the shadows that had haunted them. At the end of the letter was a small surprise, a yellowed note, carefully folded. The handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas. Vivian's heart tightened as she opened the note, but she read it with a calmness she didn't know she possessed. If I am ever no longer here, I want you to know that despite all my mistakes, you were the best part of my life. I never stopped loving you." Thomas's words, which might have been devastating months ago, now brought no pain. Vivian felt a wave of peace wash over her. She looked at the note, her eyes misty, but this time without bitterness. For the first time in years, she felt she could finally forgive Thomas. She understood that despite his errors, there had been love. An imperfect love wrapped in secrets and wrong choices, but still a real love. Vivian knew that holding on to resentment wouldn't lead her anywhere. By forgiving Thomas, she was finally freeing herself from all the chains that bound her to the past. With a serene smile on her face, she tucked the note away and gazed out at the sea. The past had been painful, but the future was full of possibilities. Now, with her heart unencumbered by betrayal, she allowed herself to believe in a new life, full of peace and hope. Vivian took a deep breath, savoring the scent of the ocean and the gentle breeze on her face. The pain had finally transformed into acceptance, and forgiveness brought with it the freedom she had long sought. Now she was ready to live fully, with the past at peace and the future shining brightly ahead of her.
As the secrets were revealed, both characters learned that no matter how painful the past may be, it doesn't define the future. Restoring the restaurant was only the beginning of a journey of forgiveness, acceptance, and healing. The discovery of the sun, which initially brought shock, ended up being the catalyst for both to find a new way to connect and move forward. Sometimes, life presents us with unexpected challenges, but it's these situations that allow us to grow and reconnect with what truly matters. How would you deal with such a difficult truth? What did you think of this emotional story? If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any videos, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Share your reflections. And be sure to watch the next recommended video by clicking the card that's appearing on the screen now. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.